So Donald Trump issued an ultimatum that could end NATO as we know it. As oil prices explode past $100, the president is demanding our warships enter a war that we never agreed to or face the consequences.
The Strait of Hormuz is a graveyard of tankers right now, and Washington is furious that Canada, Europe, Asia, and Australia are not diving into the fire. But here's the truth. Trump started this fight without us, and now he wants us to pay the price in blood.
And that's the part that's really hard to ignore. The countries being asked to step in are the same ones who were told repeatedly that we weren't needed.
Today we're exposing the Strait of Hormuz blockade, Trump's shakedown, and the straw that may finally break NATO.
So Trump bypassed Congress, NATO, and every other channel of diplomacy and launched a massive offensive on February 28th with Israel to strike Tehran. Now that Iran has retaliated by using drones, missiles, and sea mines to disrupt shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, well, suddenly President Trump is demanding that other countries send their warships to help clean up his mess.
But wait, Dave, I thought the United States had the most powerful military on Earth and didn't need anyone else. Allies were freeloaders, right? And now suddenly those same countries are expected to send ships into a live conflict that they didn't start.
And some of the officials are already calling this the coalition of the coerced. Not partners coming together by choice, but countries being pressured to clean up a situation that they didn't create.
And that's the contradiction. You can't spend all year dismissing alliances and then expect them to mobilize the moment you need backup, especially when you didn't even consult those alliances before launching a war that disrupts the entire global economy.
The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical shipping routes on the planet. And when traffic through that channel slows down or stops, then energy prices jump everywhere. Oil's already surged past $100 a barrel.
It's only about 39 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and massive oil tankers move through it every day carrying fuel from the Gulf to Europe and Asia. If that passage becomes dangerous, insurance prices spikes, ships stop moving, and global markets panic. It's a bit like shutting down the main highway that supplies half the gas stations in the country.
And when that highway slows down, it's not just tankers that feel it. It's gas prices, groceries, flights, shipping costs. It shows up in your life whether you're following geopolitics or not.
And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. Iran has not completely sealed the strait for everyone, but it has targeted vessels linked to the United States and its allies. That alone has been enough to send shipping companies scrambling. Commercial traffic has slowed dramatically, and naval forces in the regions are now focused on protecting tankers from drones, mines, and missile attacks. The longer that continues, the more pressure builds on global energy markets.
Which brings us to Trump's demand over the weekend. Alliances aren't built on pressure or loyalty tests. They're built on trust and coordination. And when decisions this big are made without consultation, partners don't fall in line. They actually step back.
And the response from those countries has been clear and coordinated. Australia, Japan, Spain, Sweden, Poland all have said they are not sending warships. Germany ruled out military participation entirely. And even the United Kingdom, one of America's closest allies, made it clear it would not be drawn into a wider war.
And the reasoning here is pretty straightforward. NATO's a defensive alliance. It exists to respond when one member is attacked. It does not mobilize when one member launches a war somewhere else and then asks everyone else to step in afterward.
And some of those alliances haven't just been firm, they've been pointed. Estonia's foreign minister summed it up in 2 words when he asked about Trump's demands. He said, "That's rich." Because from the European perspective, the same administration that questioned NATO's value and threatened its allies is now demanding immediate military support.
And Germany's defense minister was just as direct. He asked what exactly a handful of European frigates are supposed to accomplish in the Strait of Hormuz that the U.S. Navy, well, the most powerful naval force on the planet, can't already do itself.
And even in the United States, there's growing recognition of how risky this is. On CNN, Aaron Burnett said it plainly. This may have opened Pandora's box, because once a conflict like this expands across the region, it becomes much harder to control where it stops.
And Canada's response has been just as telling. Defense Minister David McGuinty said Ottawa will not engage offensively in this war. The government is leaving the door open to provide assistance if needed, but it's drawing a clear line. Canada will not be pulled into a conflict it didn't sign up for.
And that is such a Canadian position. Support stability, avoid escalation, and don't get dragged into someone else's war without a clear mandate.
And Prime Minister Mark Carney echoed that position in talks with European leaders this week. The priority is restoring safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz and pushing for de-escalation, not expanding the war. That puts Canada squarely in line with Europe, not Washington, on how this should be handled.
Listen, Washington and Israel acted first. They made it clear they didn't need help, and now, when it didn't turn out as expected, they are demanding that everyone else get in and help.
And politically, that's almost impossible to sell at home. Leaders in Europe and Canada would have to explain why they're asking sailors and warships to support a conflict that Washington launched without consulting them. If major powers start sending warships into a narrow waterway already crowded with military forces, the risk of accidents increases dramatically. One misinterpreted radar signal or drone attack hitting the wrong target could pull multiple countries into the same conflict. That's exactly what many governments are trying to avoid.
And China's response has been particularly interesting because Trump publicly called on Beijing to help patrol the strait, arguing that China imports massive amounts of oil from the Gulf and therefore benefits from stable shipping routes. But Chinese officials have avoided committing to anything, and instead they called on a ceasefire and talks of negotiations.
And there's a strategic reason for that, too. China is already Iran's largest oil customer, and much of that trade continues despite Western sanctions through complicated shipping networks and small independent refineries that process Iranian crude at a discount. In other words, Beijing still has access to Iranian oil, even when the political situation is like it is now.
And get this, Iran has even floated the idea of allowing some tankers through the Strait of Hormuz if the oil is traded in Chinese yuan instead of US dollars. Now, that would weaken Washington's ability to control global energy markets through the financial system.
Which means the country Trump is asking for help may actually see opportunity here. If the conflict pushes more oil trade outside the US dollar system, China's influence over global energy markets, well, it grows. And at the same time, the conflict is expanding on the ground. Israel has launched what it describes as limited ground operations in southern Lebanon against Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed militant group. Now, those operations are meant to push Hezbollah forces away from Israel's northern border, but they also risk widening the regional war. Meanwhile, the Gulf region itself is experiencing spillover violence. Drone strikes near Dubai's airport triggered a massive fire that forced flights to be shut down temporarily. Missile interceptions have been reported in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. Oil facilities and shipping infrastructure across the region are on high alert.
And all of that chaos feeds into the central question facing Western allies right now. Should they help stabilize the Strait of Hormuz even if they disagree with how the war began? Because some governments argue that protecting global trade routes is a shared responsibility regardless of politics. Others believe that sending warships would effectively make them participants in a conflict they didn't start.
And the tension's even sharper because Trump's own history with those same allies, right? For years, what has he done? He's mocked NATO members, he's threatened tariffs against their economies, questioned whether the United States should defend them, talked about taking Greenland from Denmark, and making Canada the 51st state. So now the same countries that he spent years insulting are being told that they must send ships to support a war that he started without them? That's not exactly how coalitions are built.
And that's not going to go over well with any of the citizens of those countries, including myself.
NATO isn't designed to automatically support offensive wars. Each member state decides individually whether to participate in overseas operations. That's why so many European governments are emphasizing that the Iran conflict does not fall under NATO's collective defense mandate. This is not NATO's war. It's clear that the US and the Trump administration went into this without a plan. So without even notifying any NATO countries or anybody in the world that they were going to do this, they've basically gone in and started a war and now are calling on people to come and help them.
And that's why so many countries are emphasizing diplomacy instead. European Union officials are discussing whether existing naval missions in the Middle East could be adjusted to help escort commercial ships without escalating the conflict any further. The idea is to maintain shipping security while pushing for negotiations between Washington and Tehran.
And there's also a geopolitical reality hanging over this entire situation. When Western allies start arguing with each other instead of coordinating strategy, well, it weakens the alliance that's held together for over 80 years. That kind of division, it doesn't hurt Moscow, it helps it.
Which is why some analysts are looking at this conflict and asking a very uncomfortable question. If you wanted to fracture NATO, distract Western governments, and push energy prices higher across Europe, this is almost exactly the kind of crisis you would create. And right now, the effect is pretty obvious. NATO allies are arguing with Washington instead of coordinating with it. Governments across Europe are refusing to send ships. And Russia, which has spent decades trying to fracture Western unity, well, suddenly it gets to watch the alliance argue within itself.
When Western allies are divided, distracted, and fighting politically among themselves, the Kremlin, it doesn't need to do very much now, does it? The damage is already happening without them even pulling a trigger.
And that's where we need to ask the question, who is this war actually working for? The American people, or a set of outcomes that just happen to benefit Russia? Because if your decisions consistently divide allies, weaken NATO, and drive economic pressure across Europe, at some point, people stop debating intent and start looking at patterns.
Which brings us back to the original question. If the United States has the most powerful navy in the world, destroyed Iran's navy, and launched the war without consulting allies, why are those allies now being pressured to step in? And I think that the biggest fear here, Deb, of most of these countries is that what's going to happen is Donald Trump is going to stand up and declare that he has won after everybody's in there to help protect the strait. And then what happens? He leaves and they're left to defend it.
Cleaning up the mess for America as usual.
Yeah, just look at here at home. Recently, the inflation numbers are down to 1.8%. So here we are in this situation again, where Canada is just starting to do well. Then the United States starts something that affects our economy.
It's like he is literally trying to sabotage all the Western alliance. So the situation we're watching right now, it isn't just a regional war. It's a test of how alliances function when a major power acts first and asks questions later. And what makes this moment so unusual is that the country that built and led this alliance is now the one putting the most strain on it.
So the next few weeks, they're going to tell us whether diplomacy can reopen the Strait of Hormuz or whether more countries get pulled into the conflict. Either way, it's a good reminder that global stability often hinges on a few narrow waterways and the decisions of a handful of leaders. Because what we're watching, remember, it's not just a conflict in the Middle East. It's a stress test of the alliances that have held the world together for decades. And right now, those alliances, truthfully, they're starting to show cracks.
So that's a sad truth today, but if you want more breakdowns like this, check the pinned comment and make sure you're subscribed if you haven't already, because the news just keeps on flowing and we're here to break it down for you in plain terms.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.